Hello there, welcome back. This is the final hour of the show with me, Alex Phillips, with you until 1 o'clock, when I then hand over to the glorious Ian Collins, who'll be keeping you company thereafter. But let's get back to matters political, shall we? And catch up now with a good friend of this show, Lord Robert Hayward, Conservative peer and pollster extraordinaire. Lord Hayward, it's great to have you back on the programme. Let's discuss the big story today, which is Ed Miliband's race to reach net zero by 2030. Oh, it's going to create so many jobs. It's going to unshackle us from the mercurial whims of ne'er-do-well states on whom we rely for fossil fuels. It's going to be a green revolution. Bills are going to go down. We're going to get this all done in about 5 years' time. That's for the birds, isn't it?
And it's the last item that is the one that's most for the birds. The target timescales are just insane. Even though the government has said that they will take the power to take decisions in relation to large infrastructure projects, the chances of actually getting an application, consideration, approval, ordering the equipment, construction, and then online within 5 years really just doesn't stand serious consideration. What other benefits we'll clearly discuss in the next few minutes, but it's just not going to happen by 2030.
No, it seems to me that they keep talking about an energy mix. You can't just throw up a nuclear power station that quickly. SMR technology is still, in theory, going through its testing phase. We're not doing enough, I don't think, to support it. But even if we're going to build all of these massive onshore wind farms, and of course, Ed Miliband's turned around today and said, well, the government now has full control over planning permission when it comes to our energy projects. Whereas before, local residents could have said, I don't want that big transistor thingamajig at the bottom of my garden. I don't really want all those lovely local fields to be turned into one massive wind farm, and could have taken it to court. The government have given themselves absolute power to reject those protests. So they sound like they mean business.
They do mean business, but you can still go for judicial review. If the government attempts to take every single power away, then the British people still have the right to go to court. So this is a matter that is going to take time. You just referred to nuclear reactors. There was an answer in the House of Lords earlier this week which said that small Magnox reactors would not be in operation in this country till 2035. So clearly that's not part of the plan that one's talking about by 2030. I'm in favour of phasing out fossil fuels. There's no question about it. I'm in favour of using wind farms, turbines for estuarial projects, wave projects, which, by the way, are things that ought to be considered but are not being considered by the government at this stage. There's the technology available, and after all said and done, tides and waves are permanent, more permanent than the wind. But I just wish that the direction of travel was sensible to achieve the ultimate sensible goal.
Why does Ed Miliband seem to love wind farms in particular so much, when on a day like today the wind's just not blowing and the grid has to be propped up by things such as gas?
The answer is I don't know. There's no question there is an opportunity to use wind farms, but as you say, there has to be alternatives available as well, which is why I cited wave and estuarial projects, as well as small nuclear reactors and the like. So we need a mix. You can't rely on any one particular form of energy generation. But there is no question about it. The timescales won't work. It's all very well saying you're going to do something by a certain date, but let's have a realistic date.
Whenever I hear this, Ed Miliband often tells us the public are really behind us. The public want us to deliver net zero. It's a huge concern for lots of people out there. They fully support us in our zealotry to get this done. I don't know if you know this, but as a pollster, I thought I'd ask you, where is public opinion on this?
Public opinion, if you ask that bland question, they will say they're in favour. But it's rather like motherhood and apple pie. If you ask that sort of question, people know how they're supposed to answer. If you then ask the people of Suffolk and Norfolk and Essex, do you want power cables running from the North Sea across their counties to supply power to London, to Cambridge, to Northampton? The answer is absolutely categorically no. So when you do polling, you should ask a question which people can answer sensibly with the knowledge of the facts, not some broad generalisation.
And in terms of the house building blitz as well, because that was, the news from earlier on this week, that there's going to be this plan again overriding NIMBYism to build as much as possible, where 7 in 10 houses are likely to go to migrants. But if you sort of crudely do the statistics on how many people have come into the country and therefore need to get some of this housing stock, is this going to have an effect as well on Labour's popularity in certain parts of the country? Things, not just in Norfolk and Essex, where they're talking about these huge sort of power cables, but in other parts of Buckinghamshire, for instance, where they want to target building a whole load of houses on potentially greenbelt land.
Yes, they're describing grey belt, and they cite examples as things like petrol stations, which are no longer used. Well, you can't get many houses on the site of a petrol station, and they're talking about building thousands. And there's no question about it. All the polling evidence shows, and local election results, if you campaign against a development, you are likely to get elected into office. Now, I'm not in favour of that overall, but there's no question that people have very strong views on extensive housing developments. One of the best examples that if you talk to any politician, they will say that the person who's most opposed to the next housing development is the one who's in the last house of the previous development, because they don't want to lose the fields alongside them. And the thing the Labour Party has to take note of now is that they have large numbers of MPs who represent the shire counties. That wasn't the case previously, and there's no question that there is a group of Labour MPs who have formed into almost a lobbying team to campaign against certain things which the government is pushing for, because they know their constituents are not going to like it, and in most cases they're on very, very small majorities.
I mean, coming up, we do have elections next year, county elections, unitary authorities as well, I believe. Where do you think they're going to produce some shock results? Because we're in this position, aren't we, where the incumbent government, sort of more unpopular than incumbent governments ever been at this point in their tenure. Sir Keir Starmer deeply disliked by and large. So you'd imagine that the Labour Party might take a bit of a hit, as you expect the party in power to do, but perhaps more so than would otherwise be expected. And I get the impression as well that at the moment the Conservative Party haven't really made many waves, even though they've got a new leader. So do you think these could be sort of quite interesting elections in May? Some shocks, perhaps, especially from Reform?
I'm sad enough to believe that any election result is interesting, but that may not be the view of the public at large. But there's no question that next year's local elections, the county council elections, will be particularly interesting. But the Tories start off from a difficult position, and that is that these places that are being fought next May were last fought in the vaccine bounce, Boris's best year, quite extraordinary year for any sitting government, where they won seats all over the place in unnatural Tory territory, places like Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, those sorts of places. So the Tories were facing losses. Interestingly enough, in council by-elections since the general election, the Tories have been making gains. So when it comes to next May, they may not lose as many seats as one might think, but they will be interesting, because not only will you have Reform lapping at the heels of both the Conservatives and the Labour Party, but you will also have in some parts of the country what I describe as the Gaza independents, fighting Labour in places in Lancashire, for example, and in parts of Yorkshire, parts of Nottinghamshire. So they will be very, very interesting elections indeed. But the one thing that you can guarantee is that all the political parties on the day after the local elections will claim that they've done well.
Well, here we go. Here's some great news for the nation. Apparently 609 Channel migrants arrived in the UK yesterday on 9 small boats. 9 on one day. A proper little flotilla. It's the highest
Well, it's
number.
not very... I'm going to say they're not very small boats. When that was read out at the news, on the news headlines, I thought, if you're going to get 600 people on 9 boats, that represents somewhere around 70 per boat. Yeah. That ain't small.
I mean, this is a problem, isn't it? Because the total number of migrants who have now arrived under Labour is 21,008. The total number for 2024 reached 34,582 so far, the second highest since records began. I mean, not the Conservative government didn't get a grip on this, but neither's Sir Keir Starmer right now. At least, actually, we now learn that we're going to have a word with China and say, oh, can you stop exporting all of those engines that are being put into these boats? But his plan just doesn't... There's a few arrests, yes, he's managed to deport 37 people to Pakistan, but it's, you know, it's a drop in the ocean compared to the problems we're facing. I mean, that's going to be, even though it's got nothing to do with local elections, it's a topic that still plays very heavily on the doorstep, doesn't it?
And there's no question about it, it does. The general election on July the 4th was mostly about getting rid of the Conservatives after 14 years. It was not about voting for the Labour Party. You have a position where the Labour Party got 34% of the national vote, which is the lowest. It's a lower percentage than Jeremy Corbyn got when he got a hammering in 2019. Labour starts off from a weak position. And unfortunately for them, all the local elections are showing that they are having a very torrid time. They lost a seat yesterday in St Helens and Council to Reform. They almost lost a seat the other week to Reform in Sheffield. So it's not just the Conservatives that have been facing a challenge from Reform, it's Labour as well. So there is no certainty about the elections, and the Labour Party is starting, in terms of national elections, from a very weak position.
Well, I mean, that's it, actually, because people always talk about splitting the vote, and perhaps the Labour Party is sitting there rubbing their hands together with glee, going, oh, that's brilliant, you know, Reform and the Conservatives will fight each other and then we'll get a second term. But if you look at it, 98 second places Reform got in the general election. I think most of those were seats that Labour won, and not necessarily by big margins. Should Sir Keir Starmer be looking at Nigel Farage and thinking he's the person I should be most afraid of?
Oh, there's no question about it. If one looks in detail, as I sadly do at the local council by-elections each week, the message is absolutely clear that now Labour should be as afraid of Reform as the Conservatives. There's no question about that.
Yeah, I think you're probably right there. And finally, let's talk about the trains. I don't know when the last time you took a train is, but apparently you can't really get on one these days because we've given the train drivers big bumper pay rises. People say, well, they deserved it, their money needed to go up. But their average salary is now £69,000, which is pretty decent, I think. Most people out there listening would say, yeah, that's all right, it's not bad. But they no longer want to do overtime as a result. They've got their pay settlement and they think, I'd much rather at Christmas spend time with the family. I mean, it's an unexpected consequence, isn't it, of Labour's decision? But yet again, I feel like whenever they make a decision, they do it by some sort of ideology, and there's absolutely no impact assessment.
Before I came into Parliament, I spent my time in industry with very large corporations, negotiating with trade unions on behalf of management. And what Labour did was, when they came into power on July the 4th, was break nearly every negotiating rule in the book. You just hand over money without any form of negotiations about productivity. They didn't think about the implications on other workers who were not getting the same sums of money but work in the same industry. So it was inevitable that they pretty soon after they'd handed out this huge sum of money, that other people were going to come back and say, I want more, or alternatively, the abuses to the system to which you just referred had not been negotiated away as part of the package, which they should have been. Most companies, if they depend, and bus companies, train companies, a number of other organisations, depend on overtime, there are arrangements in relation to overtime working in those sorts of industries, which, to be honest, along with many other things, should have been negotiated away on the railway industry a long time ago.
Lord Hayward, it's been fantastic catching up with you again. I always appreciate your intelligence and your candour.